Welcome back to FM Live. My name is Mike Usrey, and today we're going to be covering a bit of basic information about spark plugs and wires. And this may be something that you think, oh yeah, spark plugs, wires, no big deal. You know, you need to know that you have them, and that's pretty much it. And for a lot of cars, that is true. So we're going to dive in a little bit deeper. We're not going to go too terribly crazy, but just to kind of show you what you may consider, depending on your application, that you might need to change spark plugs or wires for. So hopefully this sparks your interest a little bit. But if you have questions about any of this stuff as we're talking about it, I'll try to cover as much as I can. Of course, there's limited time. If we don't cover what you're looking to find out, drop us a comment down below, and I'll try to answer those maybe at the end, or we'll answer them in the comments after we have finished the video. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Spark plugs, wires, most people know what they are, right? You know, you've got some funny looking stuff that's bolted onto your engine and, you know, it goes zap zap, right? Okay, yeah, I mean, duh. You have an ignition coil that hangs out somewhere on your engine. Most engines, actually nowadays, you don't even see these anymore, but if you have an NA or NB Miata, you know what this is. This is a wire that goes from your ignition coil, and then this will plop down into the top of your valve cover and reach down to your spark plug, which is threaded into your cylinder head, and it will transmit spark energy from your ignition coil down to the spark plug, jump the gap, and hopefully ignite a mixture of air and fuel to be able to set off combustion in that cylinder. So pretty straightforward. It's something that every car has to have some kind of a source of ignition, assuming that we're talking about most petrol vehicles. If you have a diesel, this doesn't apply, but most people don't have diesel Miatas. So we'll just skate over that. So this is something that most everybody is relatively familiar with. If you have an NC or ND Miata, you don't have cables. Well, I mean, you do, but you don't have like a spark plug wire going from an ignition coil to a spark plug. You just have a ignition coil that sits over the top. It'll look something like the end of this, but it'll just have a module on top, and it literally sits down on top of the spark plug. There's no additional wire. So the wires don't really concern the NC and ND crowd unless you've done something a little off the path of what's normal. So for most of this, I apologize in advance for NC and ND owners. There's not going to be as much topic that we're going to cover. But for NAs and NBs, this applies to pretty much everybody unless you've done a pretty fancy coil on plug setup. So let's go ahead and talk about, let's go ahead and jump into why you might be considering different types of spark plug wires and spark plug wires and plugs themselves. So normally from the factory, of course, your car comes equipped with what is appropriate for stock power applications and for stock usage. Now, if you decide that I want to go race my car, I want to go do autocross with my car, I want to slap a big turbo on my car, you know, whatever. There's a number of different things that you may want to do with your engine to modify it so that way it makes more power, and with more power comes more heat. That's just a byproduct of power. Unfortunately, engines aren't 100% efficient, so heat is always going to be a byproduct. With more power comes more heat. And with that kind of additional stress, you need to be able to plan for an appropriate upgrade for your ignition system in most cases, because stock ignition systems do have a limit. Where they end up hitting the ceiling for what they can handle depends on your car, but that is something that you have to be aware of. So let's go ahead, we'll talk spark plug wires first, because they're a little bit more straightforward for most people. Again, we're not going to get off into the weeds, so if I don't cover your particular situation, maybe give us a call or send us an email and we can talk to you about your setup in particular. But for NAs and NBs, you're all familiar with the black. It's just stock wires that come on pretty much all of the cars, and these do fine. You know, for most people, these last a good long time, and they're fine. If you're making stock power levels, it's okay. They do get old. They do need to be replaced. It's just regular rubber components, but they work fine. Now, when you get into an application where you need to be able to provide a high energy spark, that may not be enough. You may need to step it up to something that has less resistance. You may need to step it up to something that just has a bigger conduit, or think of it like if you've got a garden hose versus like a straw. The straw obviously is going to only be able to allow a certain amount of fluid to travel down the straw, so you want to have more fluid, or in this case, more voltage. You want to have a larger conductor. So when you're talking about lines, a lot of times you'll talk about the diameter of the cable itself. Now, of course, there is the sleeving on the outside. It is an insulator because you don't want that spark energy getting out. You want to make sure it gets down to the spark plug. So there is insulation that's always going to be on your spark plug wires. So on these guys, it's a bit harder to tell, and I apologize, I don't have one that I can show you like a cutaway, but these will have a larger conductor inside of the insulation compared to the factory cables. And that's just a way to be able to allow more current and more voltage to travel down this reliably compared to a stock wire, which it's going to have its limits. Up to some point, basically it won't be able to keep up, and you'll likely have issues with misfire. Generally, it's going to be misfire at higher RPM and higher load situations, such as when you're in boost, depending on how much power your engine's making. So having a beefier set of wires helps to just eliminate that bottleneck, or essentially that small straw that you want to have a larger volume to be able to push energy down. Pretty straightforward. There are different kinds of spark plug wires. Of course, you look at all kinds of other manufacturers, and there are a ton of options out there. Unless you're doing a pretty specific racing application, like if you're doing roundy round or dirt track, or something where you don't have a lot of electronics in the vehicles, you might be looking at like suppressorless style ignition wires and things of that nature. Really, for Miata owners, that's not much of a concern. Generally speaking, you want a road and street style cable that has a EFI resistance style line. And what that means is that inside of this guy, you do have the main cable that transmits the power, but it also has a coil around it that will prevent RFI, not EFI, RFI noise or radio frequency interference from tampering with that signal. Because if you've got a bunch of, let's say, communication stuff, if you're in a race car and you have like a GPS data logger, or if you have some kind of a communication stereo setup that you can talk to, a radio setup to talk to other people outside the car, you may have strong radio frequencies that are interfering with that ignition source. And you might not think that's a big deal until you're on a racetrack and your engine starts misfiring because you've got interference. Electricity is affected by radio frequencies. So needless to say, if you're looking for something for most street cars and track cars, something like the Magnecor spark plug wires that we carry are a safe bet. They cover the vast majority of applications for most people. Another thing that you would probably consider with these guys as far as why you might replace them, even if it's not just power related, but the stock wires, they do get old. They are made of just rubber, so for a long time they will last a good long time, which is excellent for most applications, but even under stock applications, they will start to get old. They will start to crack and start to wear out. So you can either get replacement ones from Mazda, or you can also get some aftermarket ones, and these guys will likely last as long, if not much, much longer, as far as our experience with them has been, because they have a much higher grade silicone sheathing over the top of them to protect them that withstands the test of time and temperature a lot better than rubber. So from the factory, Mazda recommends that you change your spark plugs about every 60 to 75,000 miles. They don't actually give a recommended replacement maintenance schedule for your wires, so that's one of the things that you should probably look into anytime you're replacing your spark plugs or doing like a timing belt. That's another job that's usually spaced out about 60,000 miles. And just do an inspection. Does it look like it has any real tears? Does it look like it's worn out? You see, like this one, you can actually kind of maybe sort of see that it's got some damage. It's been crimped, so stuff like that, be aware of, check into it. Doesn't take more than a couple seconds to pop these guys out and just look them over. If you have misfire issues that you're trying to track down, it might be because you've got a cable that's worn out. Pretty simple thing to find out. Another easy trick is that if you pull a spark plug out and you pull the wire off and you still have it connected up to your ignition coil, you can set this on top of the valve cover or some other unpainted surface, turn the engine over, and see if you've got spark. If you don't have spark and you're making good contact between the threads and whatever metal surface that is, then you may have a wire that is no longer transmitting that spark energy to the plug. So, I think let's go ahead and move on to spark plugs. I'm just checking out some of my cheat sheet stuff to see where we are. So spark plugs, inherently there's a lot of choices of spark plugs that are on the market, and you can get all kinds of different stuff. I'm sure when you think spark plugs, probably the thing that comes to mind is like copper spark plugs, iridium spark plugs, platinum spark plugs, and you name it. There's all kinds of other marketing terms that manufacturers have blasted all over to try to sell you that their spark plugs are better than others. And it's true. There are some that are good, there are some that are bad, there are some that work just fine no matter what you put them in. But really, we need to get down to brass tacks with what should you be putting in your car. And for the most part, the manufacturer specs for Miatas are pretty close to spot on. There are definitely going to be applications where you might need to consider doing a different kind of spark plug, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. So to kind of cover the basics for spark plugs, as I mentioned before, Mazda does recommend that you replace these about every 60 to 75,000 miles. Now, this is under stock conditions, so if you're driving your car on the track, if you're driving it very aggressively, autocross or whatever, you may need to lessen that or shorten the span a little bit, because you may actually have spark plugs that wear out faster than that, depending on what they are, because under more extreme use, they get hotter and they see more wear. And when I talk about more wear, I'm actually talking about here at the very tip. This is where your spark actually happens, and you're like, where? Okay, yeah, sorry. Little itty bitty gap. We're usually talking like 30 thousandths, 35 thousandths, maybe 40 thousandths of an inch gap, that there is spark energy that jumps from that node there in the middle to this little metal tang on the outside. And it's very, very high energy spark. And it happens many times a minute as your engine is running. And what will happen is that spark will actually start moving, removing material, and that material just gets burned away in the combustion process. So that node there in the middle, and even this little tang, will start to kind of shrivel up, sort of. It'll look like it's been shaved down, or you'll see that it'll kind of have wear where it's not the same shape. It'll be missing parts of it. Not generally like nicks and stuff, but just it'll start to wear down, it'll start to erode. And so they do need to be replaced occasionally. They are wear items, and that's why Mazda specifies a maintenance schedule for them. So, for instance, you can see this spark plug. This guy has been in an engine for a while. It's actually not in terrible condition, but you can see that the ring around the top here has experienced a lot of carbon buildup. It's a little bit dark. So this, I don't actually know where this one came from, but it's very likely that this came out of an engine that either was used on the racetrack or at least had some boost, because it is a little darker than what you'd expect. Normally a nice, clean running engine, you'd see kind of a sandy color, where this would all be kind of just a sandy beige color. That means everything's running nice and everything's healthy. So being a little bit dark as it is here, it looks like it probably came out of an engine that may have had a bit more let's just say happy use than others. We're all enthusiasts, right? So if you see this is not abnormal for most enthusiast-owned Miatas, actually. The thing to watch out for is that you don't want to have huge amounts of carbon build up here. So if you see that it's getting really built up or really flaky, that's definitely a problem. You probably have either excessive fuel that's getting squirted into the chambers, or maybe that you even have excessive oil consumption going on, that you're actually baking oil onto these spark plugs. So, the easy answer for most people is that when you see this or see something like this, or when you come up on your maintenance schedule, is simply to buy a new set of spark plugs. Luckily for most of the spark plugs that are used in Miatas, they're not terribly expensive. Especially if you own an NA or NB Miata, you can have them for as little as about 13 bucks for all four. Now, generally we do recommend using just a standard copper style spark plug for the NAs and NBs. And the reason for this is because that's what they came with from the factory. This plug, actually right here, this is an NGK BKR6E. This is actually a factory style plug. So this is exactly what Mazda would have had in them from the factory. And this is what makes them run very easily, very well, very efficiently for the most part. So why might you do something different though? Now, I'll show you an example, because this is another thing that is usually kind of a bit of a voodoo trick for most people. As you can see, yeah, they're spark plugs, and then you realize, yeah, what's going on with the middle? Why are they shorter, or why are they longer there in the middle? You can see that this one, that little node is kind of tucked down in there amongst all the threads in the center. And then this one, a little bit taller, and then this one, of course, it sticks out quite a bit. Well, it's not the end-all be-all, but generally this is related to their heat range. And when I say heat range, you're like, what do you mean? Do they run hotter or colder? Sort of. They do. So a spark plug like this one, sorry, fumbling around here. A spark plug like this one that is on your left is a heat range 7 spark plug, meaning that because it's been tucked down in here, it actually needs to run, the engine needs to run a bit hotter to keep up with how this temperature-wise should be operating normally. Now, adversely, or conversely, this one over here, you'd normally want your cylinder temperatures to be running a little bit cooler because it's exposed. So the more exposure that this center section has, the easier and quicker it's going to get warmed up. And there does get a point where it can get too hot, and actually if it gets hot enough, you can actually crack this ceramic and blow your spark plug up. That's kind of an extreme case, so it's not often that you'll see that. But temperature-wise for Miatas, for NAs and NBs generally, you'll want to run usually heat range 5 if it's a very stock car. You know, if you only do city driving or even highway driving, heat range 5 is fine. If you're an enthusiast driver, or if you have maybe a mild turbo setup, you might be more interested in doing like a heat range 6, something like that. It's kind of middle of the road. It's a little bit colder, meaning that you can be more aggressive with your driving. The engine will get hotter, the cylinder temperatures will get hotter, and then because it's a slightly colder plug, it stays a little bit cooler, meaning that it's more reliable and it works better for actually transmitting that spark energy at those cylinder temperatures. Now, you could do this one, the number 7. Say if you had a built engine, big turbo, something like that, you might be looking at a heat range 7 spark plug, meaning that it's way tucked up in there to help protect that ceramic and the node in the middle from a little bit more cylinder temperature, so that way it runs a little bit cooler. Hopefully that helps to answer some of the questions about heat range, but know that the majority of people, for most cars, most Miatas anyway, are usually looking at heat range 5 or 6. Okay. I'm thinking that I covered a whole bunch of what we've already been asked about, and I'm trying to go down the list. So again, thank you for providing questions for us to talk about in these videos. Oh, here's a good one. So we had a question about what we call or refer to as the extended reach spark plugs. So that's actually this guy in the end. So I did show you before the heat range 6 and 7, and technically, whoops, sorry, this one. Technically, these are actually both heat range 6 spark plugs, even though this one is a little bit more tucked down compared to this one, it's, you know, a little bit, it protrudes further. So this one, it is still a heat range 6, but it's an extended plug because it's actually moving the whole assembly further out into the chamber, even though it's the same rated heat range from NGK. So the reason why we like these is because when it's installed in the engine, it does protrude down just a little bit further. We like the heat range 6 for most applications because we think, you know, most of the people that are looking to get upgraded components or are driving these cars, you know, like sports cars, they're driving a bit more enthusiastically. So having a slightly colder plug than the factory 5 range plugs is a good idea. And it also moves the spark a little bit lower in the combustion chamber. You know, we're only talking a little bit, but it effectively advances the spark or the ignition timing just a hair. So, not a big deal. The other really big thing that we like about them is that this box of spark plugs is like $12.95 or something like that. It's really cheap. We'll put a link in the description below so that way you can see what it is on our website. But you can have all 4 of these for under 15 bucks pretty easily. So, the other question about them is that does it help just turbo or does it work for naturally aspirated on those extended spark plugs? It is great actually for naturally aspirated engines. It's not as much of a difference or doesn't make as much of a improvement as far as the spark quality is concerned on a naturally aspirated engine because you're not really asking as much of it as you would on a turbo or supercharged engine. But if you are an enthusiast that does drive the car happily, then, or aggressively, I guess, I'll let you pick which one you like, that it is something that I would consider doing those extended plugs rather than just a stock off-the-shelf 5s. If you do a ton of highway miles, or if it's just, you know, just for putting around town on Sundays, I'd probably stick with the 5s. You know, the stock spark plugs are great for that kind of thing. Okay, so the other big question that often comes up is when we get asked about the different kinds of plugs, like should I get copper, should I get iridium, should I get platinum? And the answer is it depends on your engine. So for NAs and Bs, we typically don't see real improvements of changing out from a copper style plug to an iridium or a platinum style plug. And hopefully you can kind of see, maybe my face will help to keep them a little bit clearer. But you can see that this plug on the left, that little node is really thin. And that's because the material that it's made of is a much stronger, much harder metal, and so it doesn't wear as quickly. So you can get away with a much smaller node than you can with a copper plug because it's a softer metal. It will wear more quickly. And some vehicles from the factory, such as the NCs and NDs, do call for iridiums. I think these are laser iridiums. Ooh. So some vehicles from the factory, they do require these, and you can actually see a detriment in the power delivery and possibly even have issues with misfires if you change out to a lesser quality plug, simply because the spark energy that these guys are usually transmitting are going to be higher than what it was in the NAs and NBs. So if the manufacturer, Mazda, recommends this for your NC or ND, I would stick with these guys to make sure that you're not going to have issues down the road, especially if you have a modified engine that is, you know, either high compression, supercharged, turbocharged, something like that, that's seen higher cylinder temperatures. Okay. I think that I've gotten through most of our questions. Let me stop here and see if we have any questions that have popped up that I haven't answered. Nick, what do we have? Have I actually covered them all? Oh, okay. And I will apologize in advance if you asked a question that wasn't directly related to spark plugs and wires. We will get to that down below in the comments rather than covering it in the video. If, for whatever reason, I didn't cover your question and you're watching this after the fact, or the comments didn't come through as quickly as they should on our end, I apologize, but we will get back to those comments after the fact. We'll respond to them down below. And or if you're watching this on YouTube, we'll also respond to those comments too there. So I think that for now, we're going to leave it there. I don't want to muddy the waters too much. I just wanted to do a very basic entry-level look at dispelling some of the common marketing myths that you might hear from different manufacturers on spark plugs and even wires, just because you jump on the forums and everybody has their opinion, and then the marketing, gurus off it wherever will tell you that you need this, that, and the other. Really, it can be boiled down to a few basic things when you're looking for upgrades like this, and you don't have to pay attention to all the fluff and sparkling magic stuff that happens, smoke and mirrors. So if you have more questions than that, feel free to leave them in the comments. Also, you can give us a call, send us an email. We'd be happy to talk to you more about your ignition system if you need help. And especially for those of you that are looking to do something a bit more extreme. We have more information and can help out with those cases as well. We just didn't cover it in this video for the sake of keeping things simple. So, other than that, I certainly appreciate you checking in with us to hopefully learn something about your ignition system. And we will see you all next week at 2 o'clock Mountain Time on Thursday for another episode of FM Live. Thanks again. We sure appreciate it. Have a good one.